If you're a Newcastle United fan, you're probably watching this right now with a big smile on your face because I'm about to say this. Newcastle United top their Champions League group. Who saw that coming 2 years ago? And have an opportunity here to possibly go clear a little bit. We knew the home games were going to be crucial for Newcastle, and they come up against Dortmund, who are bottom of the group, but a group of death in Group F. Sorry, it's hard for me to say. This is a huge opportunity for Newcastle, isn't it, going into this? And despite the kind of feeling that it might be a little bit too much and it might get overpowered by these giants of the game, Newcastle, hot off the heels of that PSG win, will go into this with enormous confidence, right, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I saw this coming 2 years ago, but I will say that I did look at that group and still thought, I think Newcastle will come out on top of that group. I would back Newcastle to beat every side in Europe.
Should we be wary of the sort of, sometimes we can have that sort of Premier League lens as people live in this country, but watch this league in particular and watch Newcastle, understand that it has a bit of a monopoly when it comes to the money, when it comes to the sort of the big five leagues, and just think that they should be better than these other huge guys, or are we discrediting those other teams when we suggest
it's at home,
but they're a novice Newcastle in terms of being in this group and being in the Champions League.
Yeah, Champions League heritage is a thing for sure, but like you said, they're at home.
Anyone,
and against a Dortmund team that, the bottom.
Can you explain that to me? Why is it a thing?
What, being at home?
Why is Champions League heritage a thing?
Because there's players who, you see it when players are standing there before the game, they hear the Champions League music and they have a reaction to it. And the players who've been there before don't have a reaction to it. And that innately tells you that there's something different about these games. And when you're going away to the San Siro, that at the time, I think a lot of Newcastle fans are disappointed they didn't go for the game a bit more. In hindsight, that's an incredible result. That's a great result because that stands them in good stead. And I think Eddie Howe would have been aware of that Champions League heritage, knowing that they go into a stadium that a lot of the players haven't been before, go and get a point, and they'll stand us in good stead in the group. Nobody expected them to beat PSG the way they beat them, but I think that Eddie Howe would have been confident that they could get some sort of result, and now they stand in great stead. They play against a Dortmund team who I think we all expect them to beat, and if they win this game, they're not as good as qualified. They've still got a bit of work to do, but they're pretty much there. And so when you're talking about Champions League heritage, it's a case of being there, feeling the environment under the light, 7 or 8 o'clock kickoff. It's just a different environment. And despite the fact that Newcastle players have played a lot of big games at St James's Park under lights, playing midweek is just something a little bit different.
Can the heritage become? Because I think for me, why we're all backing Newcastle a little bit is because of the home games, is because of the crowd, and that's not down to heritage. That's down to sort of the power of adrenaline. And I think the heritage could be almost like adds another dollop of adrenaline for Newcastle players and fans.
I almost felt that in the PSG game, though, that there was a little bit of Champions League heritage in that game. Like the Newcastle fans remember that night when Asprilla ripped apart Barcelona. That was a real famous European night at St James's Park. I almost felt like that heritage from then transferred into that game against PSG, and it was a huge performance against PSG.
And that's smart, isn't it, from Eddie Howe? Like, in terms of the ingredients you have to win a game of football, that's totally what Newcastle did. Like, if you look at the possession stats in that game against PSG, they didn't have the ball, but they pressed, outrageously, and they took their chances as well. Against this Dortmund side, do you expect Newcastle to play in exactly the same style?
I think Dortmund are a hard team to judge because I think they've actually, on the face of it, done quite well to bounce back from, one, the disappointment of the end of last season where they chucked away winning the title, and 2, they've lost the best young midfielder in the world. Yeah. But they've recovered from that. They've not had a terrible start in the Bundesliga. They've got that European experience, that European nous in these kind of games against Newcastle. Maybe that's one thing that at the moment Newcastle won't have coming up against awkward opposition. I felt like PSG almost played into their hands a little bit, whereas I don't feel like Dortmund will do that. I think Dortmund have got aspects that they can lean on. So I think this will be a very different type of game to the PSG. I think this will be. I think Milan away was a tough test. I think this is probably up there.
So I think that's really interesting because I agree with you. The fact that PSG was so stacked.
4-2-4.
Yes. It was, they showed an element of, I don't think it was naivety, I think it was arrogance, really, up against Newcastle. And they paid for it. This Dortmund side will look to control the game a little bit more, you would imagine. Do you think this is actually a harder game than the PSG game?
It will be, yeah, because, like you touched on, there was adrenaline in that first game at St James's Park back in the Champions League. I haven't watched this Dortmund team last season when they played against Chelsea in the knockout phase of the Champions League. They're a team that seemed to be caught in two minds whether they want to be a possession dominating team or if they want to be a team that played in transition. And in the first leg, they killed Chelsea in transition. Obviously, Adeyemi had the ability to go in behind and he scored their goal for them. In the second leg, they tried to revert back to a team that played a little bit more possession-based and Chelsea killed them. And Julian Brandt is a player that is very integral to everything good that Dortmund did when they played against Chelsea last season. And I think that if he can find the pockets of space, the half spaces, maybe dropping a little bit deeper, picking the ball up off the defenders and driving with it, because he's still, at the age of 27, still has a bit of physicality left in him, I think that he could have a huge effect on the game. If he doesn't play, because he hasn't been a consistent starter for Dortmund this season, then I think that Newcastle should have their way, and I don't think there's many ways in which this Dortmund team can hurt Newcastle.
I think this is a fascinating one for me, because in terms of the quality that Dortmund have and the sort of the change in formations and personnel that they offer up a lot of the time. You've got players like Marco Reus, who's now 34, but still has great quality, scored 4 goals in 4 Bundesliga starts, assisted 1, created 4 big chances as well. You spoke about Julian Brandt there. Will both of those players play in an away game? You've got the pace of Adeyemi, Cabell in goal as well. It looks like one of the best up-and-coming goalkeepers for Dortmund as well. And after what was a really shaky start to the season, they've started to find their feet. Great win against Union Berlin as well. Let's get to the predictions then when it comes to this, because I'd like to hear from you guys a little bit more, because I'm struggling. I think this is a lot uglier a game for Newcastle, because I think sometimes what comes from a night like the PSG one is that everything went their way. And that can lead to sort of kind of false hopes and sort of expectations that are maybe a little bit too high, which can make life a bit harder when it then feels a bit clunky and the opposition has the ball and it's not got the same level of adrenaline, again, to use that word, as a game against PSG will have. So I think Dortmund could be a really painful team to play against, especially on the break, because Newcastle are favourites going into this one. So how do you see it playing out?
I don't think Newcastle will venture too far forward. I think they'd back themselves to keep a clean sheet. I can see this being a little bit like the Milan game. I think it'd be 0-0.
0-0?
0-0.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, Kweku?
I think Newcastle win this game. It's a game for Alexander Isak. He's had a good start to the season in the Premier League in terms of goal scoring. He hasn't scored in Europe yet, and he gives that sense of he's a man for the big occasions. And I think if he can get his first goal in the Champions League for Newcastle under the likes of James Park against an opposition that he knows very well, then I think that this could be a day for him, or night for him. So I'm going for a Newcastle win, 2-0 Alexander Isak brace.
I'm struggling with this one a little bit. I think I'm going to lean towards backing the Newcastle fans. Again, I think under the lights in Champions League games, I think the home crowd can make a massive, massive difference when the feeling's right. And I think the feeling's certainly right with Newcastle. So although I think Dortmund will certainly get a goal, and I think it could be Adeyemi who gets that goal, maybe with a bit of magic prior to that from Royce, I think Newcastle might just squeeze over the line. I think it's going to be a 2-1 victory for the Magpies. But what do you guys think? Let us know in the comments down below.